So welcome to this session on test data orchestration with BlazeMeter Performance testing. When we're using test data, BlazeMeter allows us to generate test data on demand. But sometimes we also need that test data to exist within the application that we're testing, like perhaps in the database, perhaps in the mock service. And this is a challenge when it comes to actually using test data. We need to make sure there's consistency across the application that we're testing. So in our example here, you can see on the left, we're going to generate a username, a birth date, and a password. Now, if we were just to generate that and run a test to log into the UI, that test would fail because that user does not exist within the application's database. So obviously what we could do is publish that data into the database in some way. But the issue with this is that developers tend not to have access to the database. They certainly don't know the schema and perhaps the structure of the database. And most updates generally come from the application. So what we can do is actually use the application's API to publish the data through the API into the database. So you can see here, we're going to take the records that were generated, publish it through the API. And what this allows us to do is then also take back data that may come back from that request. So imagine in this instance, we do a publish, and in the response, we actually get the IDs for those users that we're creating. We can take that response from the application and include it in our data model. So our data model now contains not just the synthetic data that we're generating, it will contain data that's been pulled back from the test data orchestration when we actually initiate the test. So let me show you this in a demonstration. So here we are in BlazeMeter. We've imported our JMeter file, as you can see here. Now that JMeter file has been configured with certain CSV files as a requirement for the test. So when we built the JMeter file, we'd have referenced the CSV file, and that file would have contained all the data required to drive the test. When the JMeter is loaded into BlazeMeter, on the right hand side, we get this test data panel, and each of these boxes represents a CSV file. Now we could just import the CSV files and use them natively, but what we're doing here is we've got these different rules. So like date of birth, here's a rule to generate a date of birth. We've got a rule to generate a first name, a last name, to combine these into an email address. So take that first and last name and make an email address. And also even create a password. So we've got a rule here that says how to generate a password in the correct format. And if I click on the data settings, it previews what this data would look like. So if I say I wanted 100 records, it will preview what 100 records would look like, so we can validate that this is the data we need for our test. And at runtime, whatever value has been defined here, we will generate that data and use it as part of our test. So if I would just click run now, we would generate the test data based on this model. We'd then download this to our engines and we'd start the load test using the JMeter and our CSV files. Now obviously what we want to do is use our test data orchestrator to take this newly generated data and to pass it to the application server to actually create these users. So if I go to the data settings, and this time we click on the data targets, and you can see these three entries here. And what these are is each entry is basically a data orchestration job. And we can choose within our test which of these data orchestration jobs will run when the test runs. So if I go back to my test and we scroll down, you can see here, these are the data orchestration jobs we just looked at. And I can choose to run one, none, or all of these as part of the test when it runs. So let's go back to our data orchestrator. And we're going to look at this first one. So we're going to look at the user creation target. Now if I expand that, each of these is an API call. And to actually create the user in our application server, we have to do multiple steps. So the first step is actually to log in and get a token. So in this first URL, we're going to do a post command. We're going to extract the response. So the response will come back, and in the auth token in our JSON response, we will then take that as a variable, which we can then use in the next step. So this first step is very much a validation, also authentication, so we can get a token. Now you can see here the extraction, we can do the body and the header, We can also do XPath JSON and regex. So there's various ways we can extract the response. We can also use the failure assertion to say what we want to do if there's an issue. So if we add something here for a HTTP code, now based on what the response is, so we can say if we get a 500 error, perhaps, what to do. Now, we could say we want to stop. We want to stop the publishing. It could be that we want to use this process to validate the data. So we're going to pass the data we're generating to an endpoint, and perhaps if we get back a certain error code, we just exclude that data from our test, and that data will not be included in the test that we're going to run. So, like I said, the first step is to get the auth token, which then means on the second step, we can pass that as a variable. So here's our variable, which is part of the header. So this second step, we're now authenticated to the application server, and the API call is the API call to create the user. And in the body, this is the body to actually create the user. And each of these variables that you can see here equates to our data model. So we're going to take the newly created email address and pass it into our body and then send it to the application server to create a user based on the data model. So what this means is at runtime, we're going to generate 10 users. We're then also going to push those 10 users to our application server, and the response we get back will be the ID. So we talked about this. When we generate a user through the API, we may want to parse the response. We're going to take the ID that comes back, make it part of our data model, which then means we can use it in our test if we need to. And we've got a third step here, purely to say, no, let's do a get to make sure the user exists. And adding API calls is as simple as just do add API. We can then add any API call we want, any method, and build out any other steps we need. Now, once the test completes, we then go through the cleanup API. And this follows a very similar process in that we're going to do a post to get the token, followed by a delete. And all that delete does is basically take the ID that we captured when we created the user and run it as part of the deletion to remove that user at the end of the test. Now in the settings, we can choose to run these for each row of data, or we can choose to do this in one go if you need to. And we can also choose to run these on-premise and also in the public cloud. So let's go back to our test. So our data definition is now defined. We've chosen this test data orchestration job to run. Before we're going to start the test, let's go and look at our application. So what we have here is a simple query that returns the number of registered users in the database. So if I run the query again, we'll see we have 172 users in our database. And these are the last 12. And what we're going to do is we'll come back to this once we kick off our test to show that these new users have been created. So if we now go and initiate our test, during the start phase of the test, while we're provisioning the environment and doing the other things that go on in the back end of BlazeMeter, what we're also doing is generating the test data. So actually going through those rules and creating that test data, and then using that to run the test data orchestrator to then create the users. So we'll give this a minute to warm up. And let me just go back to our application server log. So if you remember, we had 172. So let me just run this command again. Right, so we now have 182. So we've generated these new 10 users, and that'll be these top 10 here. And what we'll see when we run the test is these are the users being driven as part of our JMeter test. So let's go back to BlazeMeter. So our test is now running. Now this test only runs for a couple of minutes, and what we'll do is we'll wait for the test to complete so we can look at the logs and review the test data that we used as part of this test. So at the moment, if I look at the logs, what we'll see is the normal logs for the JMeter and the system log. We can look at the API published log. So if I just download this log here, and what we'll see in the published log is the steps we looked at when we looked at the the job in the UI. So this is the data that we've generated. And then we've done the post, we've got back our token, that's the token for the application server. We've then posted the details of the user we want to create. If I scroll down further, we then get back an ID, as you can see there. And that ID we then capture and we use as the ID in our test data. And this repeats. So for the 10 users we've created, we've now got these 10 new users using the rules from test data. And these have been created inside our application server. So if I go back to our test, the test is now finished. And now if we look at the logs, what we see is, as well as the published log, there's an unpublished log. And if I look at the unpublished log, what you can see is these are the delete commands. So again, we've taken the ID, and you can see here we've then passed that ID as part of the delete process. And we've now got a cleanup process. We've created that user and removed that user. So if we go back to our application server, as you can see in the cleanup log, that's the ID is 35503, so that was there. If I run that same command in our database, we can now see that those 10 users that were created at the start of the test all got removed at the end. What we can also do within the performance test is if I look at the artifacts.zip, we also get the CSV file that was used for the test. So if I download that zip file, and we just open that, and we can then open the CSV file. So that's the CSV file there. Let's open that with Excel. And what we'll see is various things. So on this side, these are the IDs that actually came back from the application server. And the other data that we're seeing here all relates to the data we generated. So we've got our first name, our last name, our date of birth, like so, of the names. So this is all the data that was generated as part of our generation rules, as well as the ID that came back from the application server. So I hope you've enjoyed this demonstration of our Test Data Orchestrator. To find out more about BlazeMeter, go to blazemeter.com. There are many videos and blogs. We also have a BlazeMeter University where there are many free courses on BlazeMeter, as well as things like JMeter. Thank you.